Welcome to this Architecture Today webinar with Schueco. What workplaces will we want after COVID? If you have any troubles at all watching the webinar, you can click on the chatbot in the bottom right of your screen and one of our technical support team will be along on chat to help you out. And if you have any questions, click on Ask a Question and we'll get round to your questions after we've heard from our presenters today. First, to kick things off, here's Schueco UK's Commercial Director, Sean Butler.
Welcome to the latest in our series of 80 Schueco webinars. In today's webinar, we welcome three excellent speakers who will explore the latest thinking on return to the office, discuss the importance of design for work in the most significant new workplace, the home, and look at recent examples of innovation in the workplace sector. In particular, we will consider how design can aid home working, given the context that half of the UK's working population has spent time working from their home in 2020 due to the COVID lockdown, and many would like to continue to do so. Each of our speakers will give a short presentation to explain their approach and help to set the scene for today's discussion. This is a subject we're extremely interested in Schueco, as we are committed to helping create safe and healthy environments for work, whether at home, in the office, or perhaps a blend of the two. For us, this means delivering innovative products that can, for instance, maximize daylight or provide natural ventilation wherever work takes place. We can also ensure excellent acoustics and increasingly provide screens and partitions for supporting distancing. I think today's discussion will raise many other crucial and highly relevant issues for all those interested in what is arguably the most significant change to the workplace in living memory. Thanks once again for joining us. I'll now pass you back to Chris, who's chairing this morning's event. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sean. Hello, I'm Chris Foges, editor of Architecture Today, and welcome to this discussion on work after COVID. What happens to work after COVID, or assuming there is an after COVID? It will probably be its most significant outcome because it changes everything. It changes transport patterns, potentially settlement patterns, whether people go into town centres, making retail and leisure destinations viable. So it's a huge subject, and we won't get to all of that, and we won't, in fact, even talk about one of the obvious questions, which is what happens to the conventional office building. What we will instead talk about is some of the workplace types which already exist and which look to be in an advantageous position or even additionally relevant after the effects and events of the last few months. And so that includes some spaces where people can gather productively or that provide access to specific equipment or specialist services, which have a certain size or material character that allow certain activities to take place, or simply are affordable in ways that might become more pressingly urgent, depending on what happens in a broader economic sense. And they also include the home. The home, I think, as we will hear, is a place where people have always been working. They've certainly learned a lot about working from home in the last several months, and it is perhaps somewhere that we should include within the definition sort of formally of workplace going forward, because it certainly looks like it's going to be a big part of that picture. And to talk about this subject, we are very pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel who come at the subject from a variety of different perspectives. That's Carl Turner, Matt Hunter and Francis Holliss. And the format is that each will talk a bit about what they've been up to and their interests and their views on the subject. And after each, we'll have a short opportunity for questions, and then we will reconvene as a panel at the end and talk, take further questions. So if you do have questions as we go, please don't hang back. Post them in the chat box below the player, and we will get to them as and when we can. But with that, I will hand over to get us started to Matt. Thank you.
So hello, everyone. I'm delighted to share a few of my opening thoughts about what workplaces we will want after COVID. I should explain just a little bit that this context comes from very much practice. We're building a network of innovation hubs. We've been doing so for the past few years, trying to work out what works and what doesn't. And so the way we say it, we're creating workspaces that unlock potential, driving business growth. And a lot of that is coming from the world of innovation. We support very much early stage startups and scale-ups, but we don't believe it would be an effective workspace if it didn't also create collaboration with the wider community, the innovation ecosystem within any town or city, and ultimately aim to be driving positive social impact, really creating inclusive economic growth, not just growing the businesses within the buildings. Anyway, so that's just a bit of the context. But I thought what I'd do is explain to you a little bit of what we've been doing, taking this model forward, especially most recently, launching a building, our new innovation hub in Brighton, in the middle of lockdown. So this was in May this year. And so in other words, this is a model we've created over the past few years about what we believe the future workspace to be, but this is absolutely being tested within the context of COVID. And, you know, I'll explain a little bit maybe where we're seeing some emphasis, some change and all the rest of it. But broadly speaking, we think that this is a very valid concept, COVID or not. The way I wanted to start was to step back a little bit. I've been in the world of innovation for 25 years or so, and I always think understanding the main forces of innovation, what's driving everything, is really important. I thought I would pick just three. First one, demand side. What is it that is happening to businesses as they evolve? What skills are required? Because this might tell us what the workspace needs to do to support those skills. I always like to look at the World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report. They always have a very interesting list. And I think you'll notice in the top three there, complex problem solving, critical thinking and creativity, this is very much about sort of systems innovation, pretty sort of complicated stuff. And the next three, people management, coordinating with others, and emotional intelligence, that says something about people. So in other words, I reckon if you take the top six, we're talking about innovation in complex systemic contexts, but we're doing it with other people. We're not doing it alone, right? So those are the main things that businesses will need out of their workforce, and thereby, of course, the workspace will need to support that. So second, let's look at the supply side. Well, look, of course, there are people of just about every age range working in workspaces, but let's look at the new people coming in the bottom, because often what we find is that change does come from the new generations of employees that you want to attract and retain. And in this case, with millennials, there's no difference. It doesn't really matter which slide I take of millennials, they tend to say similar things. One is that if you take number one and number three there, good work-life balance and flexibility, there's something very much about not wanting to be, you know, complete sort of commuting wage slaves. This is something about recognizing the wider purpose in life, to be happy, to be well, all of those sorts of things. If we take the second and the fourth, opportunities to progress or to be leaders, and a sense of meaning from my work and many other things, we know that millennials are also got very high standards in terms of the types of progressive, purposeful, and sort of growing and learning businesses. So really, if you take even those top two of what they want for themselves and what they want in terms of the places that they work within, I think that's pretty instructive. And then finally, yes, of course, we are seeing a massive acceleration of trends that were moving along more slowly because of COVID. And I think more than anything, the way that I'd explain it is really an overcoming of inertia. We know that within any system, there are many things that hold back, that are sort of conservative forces. And there's no doubt the world of work has really had this basic sort of one size fits all approach, you know, fixed buildings, 9 to 5, single reporting lines, slightly business as usual culture. And the idea that maybe competitive advantage is a lot of the time created by scale, you know, corporate scale. So I think we are seeing a lot of that classic rule book ripped up, or at least questions at this point. So for better for worse, those are three sort of opening ideas. So what does that tell us, perhaps? How does that inform the needs that drive the design of knowledge workplaces? Being a designer myself, I always think about the underlying user needs, the business needs in this case, and the employee needs that drive the design of the knowledge workplace. So I thought I'd list 5 for you. So the first, clearly, this is one that's recently come to the top. Uncertainty has been part of many businesses for a long time, but there is no doubt that the COVID crisis, the pandemic, is creating more extreme levels of uncertainty. And therefore, absolutely, we're seeing this continued interest in space as a service. Using space as a service means that it can be much more flexible, whether I'm thinking a month ahead, 6 months ahead, or a year ahead. Most people really don't think 5 or 10 years ahead as with a lease. And so obviously we are seeing a big growth. And the big change here is really that we're seeing big businesses really consider space as a service, not just the smaller ones. We are seeing this sort of downgrading where people are saying, I don't need all the space and the long leases that I used to have. So we, in our Brighton building, for instance, on the top floor, top 2 floors might have space for 90 people per floor as a single team. Whereas in the middle floors, we've got sort of 20 to 50 person units, and then we go all the way down to 1 or 5 people. So really the point there is that we're trying to make an offer, as many co-working spaces have, across small, medium and large businesses with space as a service. But of course, what we're also seeing is that there's uncertainty around commuting. There's no doubt that commuting is more dangerous than it was perceived to be, and thereby unravels a whole other bunch of things about whether it was productive or not. And so we are seeing that people want to travel less, and therefore we are finding our situations where we're outside of central London. Those at the heart of mega cities, of course, no one really lives anymore. It's all sort of commercial real estate. And so really the workplace is moving to where people live, much more to than where they commuted to historically. Then, of course, we've got the hybrid of physical and digital. If sometimes I'm going to be digital because I'm working from home or from another location, and sometimes I'm physical because I'm co-located, how can spaces essentially blend the physical and virtual? I don't know about you, but I have good physical meetings, I have good virtual meetings, but so often the technology is not yet ready to blend the two. But there's also something else. If the first 3 are about, I don't know, responding to uncertainty, then actually there's something here almost about getting above it emotionally. What we found when people come to the workplace, the physical workplace, is that the physical presence of everyone together creates a bit of a more positive herd culture. Everyone says, wow, we're together, we can do this. And don't forget that when especially small businesses who may only have been alive for a few years are thinking to themselves, we may be living in this particular COVID pandemic context for a year or more, actually you've got to lean into it, you've got to move forward. So we're seeing a massive difference between big businesses, which are somewhat freezing due to uncertainty, and smaller businesses that are trying to plow on regardless through uncertainty. And I think this physical presence really boosts everyone's energy levels and makes them want to lean into this, not just to kind of lean back. And finally, I think the way in which we operate our buildings, our workplaces, making them COVID secure as possible, again, boosts that confidence so that people begin to forget they're in the middle of a pandemic. Secondly, attracting diverse talent. I've said before, in many ways with the talk of millennials, this is more important than ever. But I think that, again, what we've noticed, especially opening a really fabulous building in Brighton, designed by Studio Egret West, is that physical space really does wow people. It pulls them together and gives them energy. Our home spaces are fantastic. And being able to work from home does attract diverse talent, people with perhaps caring needs or something like that. But ultimately, again, where businesses need to sort of exude ambition and purpose, actually saying, we live in this building and this building is fantastic and you can use this building too. This is a great way to attract people and excite them about your business and what your business stands for. Secondly, of course, health and well-being matters massively to the millennial generation as well as many others. And actually here our roof deck, a great open space with loads of plants throughout the building. Our buildings are operated to the Californian WELL 2.0 standard, which is about air quality, mental health and well-being, support, good food, all the rest of it. Actually, what's really interesting is I think that big corporates always used to have this focus on amenities and health and well-being, but the smaller businesses couldn't. So now again, if what we're saying is that no one is officially in their own building, a big corporate might have moved their innovation team into a co-working space, or a small team wants the same quality of sort of employee experience as a corporation. Actually, the co-working space in this context has to provide that level of almost HR benefit as it might have been. Then, of course, again, hub and spoke supports flexible patterns. So we've already spoken about this in the previous slide, that again, our particular location being close to where people live also makes it very accessible if I've got a school run to do in the mornings or something like that. And finally on this one, I think, again, back to my point about inclusion, I think people really recognize the importance, especially right now in COVID, of so many younger people being unemployed and struggling to find employment, that apprenticeships and job placements and contact with schools is all incredibly important. And this is almost a service within the space. So again, what's really important is not to see space as a service as just space as a service. It's workplace as a service, and therefore support for apprenticeships. We have someone from a local charity running around the building saying, how can I help you to have an apprentice? And could we give you a discount on the desks? Thirdly, fostering collaboration. Someone said to me the other day, we used to go into the office to do work, and then we used to go off somewhere else to have offsites, and offsites were these big collaborative things. Now, of course, we work from home and we come into the office to do the big collaborative things. So how do we really foster intense, productive collaboration? Well, firstly, connected spaces. All of our spaces are custom designed, and that's incredibly important in terms of making these sort of kitchenettes and stairways and meeting rooms and deep dive sprint rooms, which really create that sort of connection and functionality. But as I said, also, because we're trying to connect small and medium and large businesses, we need to have actually to make sure that the big businesses don't just go to the top floor and shut the door. They are actually curated. We interview every business coming into the space and really try to say, are you in it to come and collaborate and to innovate with others? And if they're not, really, especially if they're a large business, we won't give them the space at the top of the building. But then, of course, it's incredibly important to bring in the other bits of the innovation ecosystem that I referred to. So we have relationships with universities, our West London facility with Brunel University and Imperial College and the Royal College of Art, and in Brighton with both University of Brighton and University of Sussex. And this is incredibly important, again, because there's so much talent and knowledge within universities, but often it doesn't come out into the workplace as best it might. Then, of course, are the digital platforms. There's something really amazing for me about digital platforms, because really mostly we have Zoom, which is just a kind of virtual room, and they've got breakout rooms. But when you really think about what it is to work, then we think about conferences and seminars. And actually, those are very complicated, very sophisticated artifacts, conferences and seminars. And really, I think none of the digital platforms have quite yet got to that stage. So I do think this is another huge area of opportunity, that these virtual spaces that are dealing with much more sophisticated programming, such as conferences and seminars, need to evolve quite a lot more. There are increasingly platforms such as Orbit and Hopin and others, but they're not yet there yet. And then finally, support for partnerships. We've got someone in the building who runs around trying to support those connections between businesses and connections with our resident businesses and elsewhere. So again, how do we find the people to collaborate with? Because actually finding new people, because we're much less mobile than we used to be, is of course harder. And so actually this proactive support for partnerships we think is very important. Fourthly, driving productivity, a bit like collaboration, but there are some other aspects I think which are very important. So firstly, infrastructure that really works. I'm very lucky, I have super fast broadband, fiber to my home. Very unusual in this country. Most people have broadband that doesn't work as effectively as it ought to. And so even those basics of the broadband infrastructure are incredibly important. So we run all our businesses to the WireScore standard. We're WireScore Platinum in Brighton. And this means we've got sort of triple redundancy. It's never going to go down. But more than that, specialist facilities, an awful lot of work doesn't just happen in the digital space. So actually we've got digital prototyping facilities, physical prototyping facilities, and even biological prototyping facilities for novel materials. Here's Katie, one of our workshop technicians with our render farm, sort of 3D render farm. And it allows people to, both those highly skilled and less skilled, begin to understand what it is to make things. And with digital making, we've got podcast studios and vlogging suites and VR suites. And all of this stuff is incredibly important, because the closer it is to hand, the more quickly you can create the material, refine the material, and improve your output. And so ultimately, I think this is very important. And too often, the workplace doesn't create this kind of specialist facilities. If I was a pharmaceutical company, I would have specialist facilities myself. But again, if we're sharing space, does anyone bother to have these specialist facilities? Often not. And then thirdly, collaborative and cultural support. Really, what's interesting, I think, is it's remarkably hard to know sometimes how to build the capacity. And I think many businesses have forgotten how to make things, and they've forgotten how to do sort of deep dives. Maybe they never knew how to do sort of brainstorms and deep dives and those intense sort of programs that, Agile, Scrum, that kind of stuff. And so actually we think it's almost like an organizational design competency building, which is also important. And increasingly, sometimes with the members in our own space, we're going to be helping people to build their organizational capacity so they know how to make, they know how to collaborate that much more. And then finally, really supporting purpose. What are the ways in which we might do that? So firstly, I think, as I said already, we curate the community. We make sure there's some pretty cool people in the building. And already we're finding in the past few weeks, people reporting saying, I've just found more amazing people here than ever before. I've made links. They've got such a great mission. I want to sort of really reset my business and make it that much more amazing. So I think never underestimate, especially in the modern world where open innovation is a big idea, learning from others outside of our own organization. That wider community across businesses is very important. But also connection to schools. This picture on the left was of a hackathon that we did 2 weeks ago, where we took a lot of graduates from design and engineering schools around the UK, and we helped them, because of their very difficult graduation in the context of COVID, to come to like a finishing school to finish off their explorations using our equipment. And what was really important is that they could tell their stories. It was being live vlogged, as you will see there. And ultimately, it was a chance for them to develop their ideas and share them with others. And ultimately, because most of these people were dealing with novel materials, actually, to do with the circular economy, what was really important is to see that actually we can all work together, not just to share knowledge with each other, but to work in concert to a big aim. You know, how can we all improve healthcare? How can we all drive towards zero carbon and zero waste? And so increasingly, we're trying to create these innovation challenges that draw together not only the members in our building, but those across the innovation ecosystem within cities and towns and across the UK. So again, this is more almost than most workplaces ever got to. So really, those are my 5 insights. And I just wanted to finish with sort of 3 conclusions. I think we need more than ever from workplaces. And too often, I think there's been the quick knee-jerk response, workplaces are dead. We don't need them anymore, we'll just work from home. Actually, we need a hell of a lot more if we're to make our businesses thrive. And I think it's actually harder than ever to provide all of that, but we're clearly one of the people trying to work out how. The second thing is just to repeat, there is no new one size. The old one size didn't work, and a new one size isn't going to work either. And so anyone that says, you know, work from home, that's it, no one ever is coming into the office again, that will be just as disastrous and just as unproductive as the previous one size. And finally, I think, you know, I hope it's become clear throughout this. This is not just about physical infrastructure. This is about organizational culture support. Really, we have to evolve as businesses to be more collaborative, more innovative, more agile, more resilient than ever before. And really, the workplace needs to do that. And especially for small businesses, they don't have the infrastructure to do that. And big businesses, as they begin to fragment and become part of hubs and spokes, they will also need that support actually to become more innovative and agile than ever before. Hopefully that's been useful. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Matt. There was a huge amount there to unpick and to have a go at. So I'll pick something almost at random from your survey there. One of the things you talked about was the current deficiencies of digital platforms for interaction, and obviously we're on one at the moment. That we're just about making them work, but they lack certain of the things that we enjoy in the physical world. And I just wondered, as a sort of provider of physical space, whether you had any views on how those tools might be expected to develop in future, and also whether you thought that was something that, in a sense, you might be looking to provide along with super fast broadband and things as part of a kind of package, a sort of hybrid package of virtual and digital spaces, or in what ways you might anticipate helping people find their own balance between their virtual and physical space needs.
Yeah, absolutely right. Really good question. Definitely, we are, even though in our building we had absolutely put in video conferencing equipment, we are upping the amount of video conferencing equipment. And you'll see I've now moved to a green screen room here. So I've got the ability in a small space, but equally our deep dive spaces, our conference spaces are hybrid. Even our main event space that can take 160 people in non-COVID times is fit for webcasting. But I think the observation I'd make absolutely is that the technology is not as easy to use as it needs to be yet. I mean, I remember going all the way back to the early 2000s. We were, when I was at IDEO, we were developing the first sort of hybrid digital physical store for Prada. OMA, Rem Koolhaas and his team, and us at IDEO. And what we were aware of is that not only, in the New York buildings, was there so much steel within the buildings that the RF systems, the radio frequency systems didn't work, but also the builders were only able to construct things to the nearest inch, whereas we needed millimeter precision. And so we were constantly putting things on gimbals to make it work. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the pure tech and microphones and feedback, or digital platforms not taking that care and attention to guide speakers and others through the many nerve-wracking moments of being backstage and then front of stage, or the physical space integration. There's an awful lot to do. So I think that we're doing our best at the moment to use existing systems and to do a good job of integrating them, but ultimately a lot more needs to be done. And if I was to observe what's happened over the past, let's say 10 years, we have these very expensive video conferencing systems that often cost literally £250,000 because it was all to do with the acoustic and the visual integration. And so only the big corporations could use it. But then of course they were far too expensive and far too complicated. So most people just used Skype initially on their laptops. So in other words, most normal mere mortals just got round the big infrastructure stuff and used their own lightweight systems. So now we probably need to get back into that sort of intermediate space with simple lightweight things where I can bring my laptop into things, and yet it can integrate into a bit of infrastructure with better acoustics and better display. It's a bit like, I think, as some people consider cars. We get into our cars and our data is on our phones, but immediately it sort of, through Apple CarPlay and sort of the Google equivalent, sort of the infrastructure of the car absorbs what was on my phone. So again, I think we've got visions of what needs to happen, but there's quite a lot we need to do, and hopefully we can test it out.
And I mean, one of the promises, of course, of the virtual world and digital connectivity is sort of placelessness and the freedom to be anywhere. But another of the things that you talked about in your talk just now was about aspects of location, and you talked about things like commuting and hub and spoke, and the sort of unavoidable realities of being in a place. And I know that you Plus X started with a West London testbed, and you've built your first, your second building, as it were, in Brighton now. Has the recent events changed the way that you think about location at all for future projects? And does thinking about different locations change the way that you think about buildings, if that is the case? Yeah.
No, I think COVID has really reinforced what we're thinking. And I'd say there's sort of a couple of things. One is, where do you situate the building? There are always two locations essentially in any regional town or city that we might consider. One is typically next to the universities, because we're interested in the talent pool that comes and the knowledge pool that comes from universities. And here in Brighton, we are just outside of the city centre, next to University of Brighton, not too far from University of Sussex. But equally, we might consider the city centre. And we've been offered all manner of former department stores, as you might imagine, are now empty, and we need to re-energize the high street. So I think that we can see from a sort of a city planning point of view, the need to re-energize the city centre, that for multiple reasons, both retail and classic commercial office space need a sense of re-energizing. But also we need to reflect where the talent pool is, and the talent pool can be linked to universities, but also residential areas. And the second thing is more around local and national and global. I remember conversations when I spent sort of about 2 years really building my connections and our Plus X connections in Brighton, that people said to me, look, Matt, of course this needs to be really rooted in the community in Brighton. But at the same time, you started your career in Silicon Valley. Bring San Francisco to us. So surely we can have the best of both worlds here, both rooted in the locality, but also connected globally.
Thank you, and we will pick up, I'm sure, on many of the other things that you talked about when we return for questioning. But before that, we will hear from Francis Holliss, who's going to talk a bit about a place that many of us have become more familiar with over the last several months, and that's the home. So over to Francis.
Great. So home as workplace, this is a big subject. And it's been a really big story in 2020, obviously. But Actually, it was a big story before COVID-19. We had a large number of people working from home all the time, and millions more working from home part-time. And it was growing really steadily, if not rapidly. And an extraordinary statistic, which I think is very little known, is that 95% of UK businesses are micro businesses employing less than 10 people. They contribute a third of all employment, a fifth of all turnover, and most of them were, this was in 2016, run from their owner's home or had been at some point. And obviously this has huge implications for the way we conceive and design our buildings and our cities. And then we've got COVID-19, which of course was a massive global experiment in home-based work. It shot up to 50% of the UK working population working from home. And the surveys have consistently said that people have really liked it. People who've been able to do it have really liked it. They've been happier, they've been healthier, they've been less stressed, they've been walking the dog instead of going to the gym, they've been saving a fortune, and the employers have liked it as well. They've been, on average, 70% have found that they're either equally or more productive than they were beforehand. So this is the image that people tend to have in their minds when they think about designing for home-based work. Handsome man sitting at his MacBook in immaculate surroundings. The reality, as I think we all know now, is substantially different. And people working at their kitchen tables, in their bedrooms, worse in social housing, where space standards are very tight and housing policies often restrict home-based work. And really tough for people whose work doesn't involve sitting at a desk with a computer. So when I got interested in this building type that combines dwelling and workplace, which was nearly 20 years ago now, I first traced its history from medieval times to the present day in England as a way of establishing its existence. And then I set out to find out who are our home-based workers, what do they do, and what are the issues, what are the spatial issues. And so I made a close scrutiny of the lives and premises of 76 home-based workers in urban, suburban and rural contexts in England, from across the social spectrum and in as wide a range of different occupations and buildings as I could find. And my first finding was that even in this small sample, I had these 8 different categories of home-based workers who had really distinct spatial and environmental needs. And so the first finding, if you like, was that recognizing that the extent and complexity of this workforce is the first step to being able to design well for it. So one size absolutely does not fit all. And there are 4 variables: the occupation, obviously, the nature of the household, the space available, and the personality of the home-based worker. People like to work in really different ways. Some people like to hide away, other people like to work in really busy public environment. And I think, you know, if you take these 4 variables, if you think about the social policy researcher with 2 small children and the single sculptor making vast constructions out of rusty steel, you can see sort of radically different spatial and environmental and urban consequences of the home-based work. But the housing that we design is basically designed so as a space where we can cook, eat, bathe, sleep, bring up our children and watch television. And this causes really major problems for home-based workers. And increasingly so. 43% of the UK homes built since 2002 are purpose-built, standard, tight-fit flats with an average usable floor area of 55 square meters. This is shown to be really problematic for home-based workers. And I think the surveys that are coming out as a result of the of the lockdown are showing exactly the same thing, that small flats are really difficult to both live and work in. So home-based workers who have inadequate or inappropriate, both interior and shared community space develop problems with, I mean, the primary one is social isolation, but occupational identity, and also it just makes people stressed. It makes life very difficult. So I'm going to go through a couple of buildings and discuss some design themes, these 3 design themes. The first, spatial generosity. The space standards we're working to at the moment simply aren't big enough because they're designed around these very limited domestic functions. If we're going to throw work into the mix, then we need to build bigger homes. The second one is agency. We can't design perfect, what I call work homes, these buildings that combine dwelling and workplace, for every eventuality. And so agency has to be built into the equation. People have to be able to adapt their environment to suit them. And at the moment, what we find is that homeowners generally under-occupy space to accommodate their home-based work, either in a disused garage or a shed at the bottom of the garden or an underused dining room or a spare bedroom. But obviously, the poor and the young don't have that possibility. So there are really interesting and important issues around social justice that come into this as well. And the third is visibility. Housing today is generally designed as inward-looking private space. And actually work has a major public function, and by making the work visible, we can contribute to breaking down the social isolation and problems with occupational identity amongst home-based workers. So the first building, both the buildings I'm going to show are Dutch. The Dutch are brilliant at housing design, and they're ahead of the game on this front. This is a scheme in New Leiden called New Leiden in Leiden. It was built on an old abattoir. It's just 10 minutes from the center of Leiden, and this it was master planned by MVRDV. And I think that we've got spatial generosity here, because the first question people always ask when I say spatial generosity, people say, but how can we afford it? And I think the first answer is clever design. And this is an example of what I think is extremely clever design in order to be able to design well for home-based work. So it's 700 homes, and the houses, it's both apartments, which are these blocks, and houses in these blocks. And this is what I'm going to focus on. It's about 350 housing and about half and half social housing and private, either rented or to buy. And it's built on a grid of blocks of 18 houses. And these houses are on extremely tight sites. It's designed as back-to-back housing. And the fact that the sites are so compact, I think they're 6 meters by 15 meters, means that it's extremely dense housing, and they get a lot of building for their money in terms of actually the cost of the land as well. So they're spatially generous because they're on compact sites and they're back to back. They're 3-story houses, 3.5-story houses, built to this design guide, if you like, quite a tight design guide about the envelope that each can build in. And they're spatially generous in terms of shared community space as well, because if we go back, you can see that the east-west circulation spaces are vehicular with shared garages underneath, and the north-south ones are pedestrian. And they're cheap because they're built in these blocks of 18, and each of the future inhabitants, each of the 18 future inhabitants has to cooperate with their neighbours to build the groundworks and the shared garage underneath. So they have this shared space, which is extremely beneficial for home-based workers, because when they stop work, they can basically go out and have a cup of tea and a break and sit and chat with their neighbours. Agency, this whole scheme is self-build. And that means that, and the reason that I got interested in it is that I found that quite remarkably, 80% of the dwellings have included a workspace of some sort. So basically, when people have the opportunity, when people have the choice, they build a workspace into their home. And when the home's imposed on them, usually it doesn't include a workspace. And this is something that really needs to be addressed in the face of the fact that from now onwards, it seems very likely that most people will work from home for at least part of the week. It seems like the statistics at the moment seem to show, or the predictions seem to be that 30% will work from home all the time, 30% will work at the office all the time, and 40% will move between the two. And so developing decent home-based workspaces is going to be really important for the future. So this is a perfectly ordinary house for a couple, and the woman is a senior manager at Microsoft. And I think the idea of agency, this illustrates it really, really well, because she has 3 small children. They have 3 small children. And as any parent of small children knows, this generates an enormous amount of laundry. And so she's designed her office, senior manager at Microsoft, in the laundry, or she's put the laundry in her office. So at the other end of the space that you can see here is a washing machine and a dryer. It opens onto a flat roof where she can dry the laundry. And she works in a way to, when she takes breaks from her work, she puts a wash on, she hangs out the washing, she folds the washing. So the task of laundry gets completely inbuilt to her work. This is something that no architect could possibly have predicted. And this is why agency is so important in terms of creating spaces that work for the individual circumstances. And you couldn't make it up, really. Her partner is a furniture maker. And so on the lower ground floor, alongside the shared garage, he has this workshop. So here we have a workhome, looks like a completely ordinary house from the outside, but it includes a laundry office and a workshop. Visibility. So 2 approaches to functional representation. In this scheme, to visibility. And the first in this scheme is functional representation, where the building itself expresses something about the work. This is the standard classic of an architect's practice that have made their own work home into a calling card. And so it stands out in its neighborhood as something people think, and then they gradually get to know that there's an architect living and working there. And they've made a big window where people walking past can actually look in and see their practice at work. So that's a form of visibility that's really beneficial both for the home-based worker, but also for the neighborhood in terms of actually communicating what's going on in the neighborhood. So it's moving away from this very closed, private, inward-looking housing. In other examples, it's simply a matter of putting in a window. Like this is a person who has a workshop for vintage. He repairs and does up vintage lamps and he sells them. So this is his shop front. Again, really unusual to see it in contemporary housing, a house that has a shop front. So the second scheme I'm going to show you is it's in Maastricht, and it's called Piazza Ceramique by Jo Janssen Architects. And it's spatially generous because it's luxury housing. And I think it's interesting because it explores some really innovative approaches to how to design living and working environments. So spatial generosity in terms of both public and private space, in terms of floor areas, and also in terms of volume. So agency is incorporated in this scheme through flexibility and adaptability being an underlying design principle. So the scheme's in 3 blocks, and it's this block that I'm particularly interested in because it's about 100 dwellings altogether, including some which are what they call office apartments, and some that are just luxury flats. And it's the office apartments I'm interested in. So the whole structure, the whole building is designed to be flexible. First of all, because of the way that the structure works. And the structure spans from the perimeter wall to this inner core. It's a donut building with an atrium in the middle. And so this is the service core. So the structure spans across, and that means that all the interior partitions, including the party walls, can simply be taken out or put in as people want them. Right, this is the atrium, which again, spatial generosity. This is public interior space, which has been used to great benefit through lockdown. It's worked very, very well because the residents who are there 24 hours a day because they're living and working can meet up in this inside-outside space. Another primary innovation in this scheme is that each of the office apartments has 2 front doors, and this duplication, which is really common in houses but is only just starting to appear in apartments, really contributes to how flexibly people can use their spaces. So this is a plan of one of the office apartments, and it shows the 2 front doors here. And one of them goes into a small lobby that has a toilet and a cupboard, and then into a small space, while the other one goes into a larger hallway with a toilet and a bathroom, and then a much larger space with a kitchen in it. And in this case, the larger space is used as working space by an architect, and the living space, the smaller space, is used as the private living space, and it's just his bedroom. And this is the scheme the other way round. So coming in this front door, this is the dwelling, and then this is the private workspace. And the workspace has an interior, an internal connection, so you can go between the 2 if you want to. Some people do, some people have closed them off. In some cases, the 2 have been separated, and people have bought an office on one floor, a workspace on one floor, and a living space on the other, so that actually they have to go out of their living space and up a few floors to go into their workspace. So the flexibility and adaptability is built in to the design. And then finally, functional neutrality. This is this scheme's approach to the visibility of the work. And in a way, it's completely the opposite to functional representation, in that the elevation is designed in such a way that every single opening is identical. And so we don't know if one of these is, for example, a dentist's surgery, or an architect's office, or any other kind of workplace, or whether it's a family home, or whether it's a single person's apartment. And some of them, in fact, are simply workspaces on the ground floor. There's a debt collector in one of them. And the fact that there's no representation of either living or working, so it's functionally neutral, both spatially and in terms of the elevational treatment, means that the work is given a gravitas, if you like, that sometimes is really lacking, particularly when buildings are of a domestic scale. And the spatial generosity in terms of floor to ceiling height means that any of the spaces in this building would work equally well as dwelling or workplace. So those are the three themes that I think are particularly important when we're designing for home-based work.
Thanks very much, Frances. Some enviable home working situations there, and quite telling that you have gone to the Netherlands to find them, and not more locally. And that actually goes to our first question that's come in from someone asking whether there are any planning issues that would need to be overcome in order to replicate that model here. And I wonder if you could actually maybe expand that and sort of talk about whether there are any issues about, for instance, different tax regimes for different types of building, or even different attitudes among mortgage lenders, or different lease arrangements, or anything else that puts up some kind of barrier to this kind of hybrid space.
That's a great question, Chris. Yes, absolutely. It's our governance in the UK presents a massive obstacle for building for home-based work, which we saw in the live-work movement of the late 20th century, where there was clearly a need for buildings designed specifically to accommodate the two functions of home and workplace. But it's simply planning, property taxation, all sorts of issues are really, really problematic, because they were developed at a time when it was home-based work was disapproved of, and so they were specifically designed to keep the two things separate. Also, in line with Ebenezer Howard's Garden City idea, which introduced functional zoning. So yes, absolutely. And what we need is major structural change. The Japanese have an utterly brilliant system where home-based work is built in. Their use class order has, in the little category that has houses, it has houses with small other function, and it's organized according to impact. And in fact, you can build a house with a small other function in 12 out of the 13 land use areas they have, zones. So yes, really major structural changes needed. We've got a binary property taxation system which basically sends home-based work underground, because it's calculated in ways that means that if you have what is called a composite hereditament, a building that combines dwelling and workplace, you very often have to pay twice. And so at the moment, my suggestion to people who want to design these buildings is do it surreptitiously. So design for home-based work, but for goodness sake, don't call it a live-work unit, or you simply won't get planning permission for it.
But I mean, in light of recent events, surreptitiously or otherwise, have you seen an increased interest among developers in trying to meet the needs of this constituency? Because I mean, as you said at the outset, you've been working on this for nearly 20 years, and people have been working at home all that while. But is this something that's now focused the minds of our larger scale housing providers on what their market is going to be wanting going forward?
Well, not to my knowledge, but I think it will do. I mean, I think that lots of developers got their fingers burnt in the live work movement, and I think that so did local authorities. And so I think there's a sort of major obstacle there, but I don't think there's any doubt that housing will, from now onwards, always have some workspace, you know, tucked into it in some way or another. People designing housing are bound to be thinking about home-based work from now onwards. And I think it's obvious in the property market that people are moving or trying to move to larger places where they can, you know, build the garden office or whatever it is, have a spare room.
Thanks very much, Francis. As you say, home-based working always existed, is now unignorable, but there are still some types of activity that really aren't very practical to do in the home, and some of those are being catered for in the projects we're about to hear about next from Carl Turner. So we hand over to Carl. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I've called my talk Agile Uses, which I think might become clear to you as we progress through the talk. This is us, we're based in Hackney, in London. I thought I'd just talk briefly about this small project, which encapsulates in many ways many of the ideas that we've been having around workspaces. It was actually just based on a one shipping container project in Hackney City Farm, probably about 10 years ago now, for a charity. And really, I think this is just getting back to basics and thinking about what we need from the world of work. It's actually also a super local workspace. It was self-built by a group of community workers, and it's still going strong now, nearly 10 years later. Hopefully you'll see the grain of that idea and how it's come through into some of the projects I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about 3 projects today: Pop Brixton, Peckham Levels, and I'm mainly going to focus on Hackney Bridge, which is on the edge of the Olympic Park in London. So Pop Brixton was really taking that idea from Hackney City Farm and pitching it into a competition entry to take over this leftover space in Brixton for probably around about 3 years. So we brought the idea of the shipping container and the idea of creating a mini city or mini campus, or a mix of spaces for work, for socializing, for entertainment, and really to create a new type of centre for the community in Brixton, but largely based around work. Lambeth Council, who were the client, really wanted to use the project as an experiment, really, to look at whether there was, I mean, crazy as it may seem now, whether there was any demand for workspace locally, because they were not convinced that there was. So yeah, this upcycles around 60 shipping containers and sort of creates a walled campus with a central courtyard, which then has a huge polytunnel in the middle that acts as a big dining hall for the local community. So really, this project was the first time that we were able to work at a larger scale, really experimenting with what the world of work might be. And these projects are often referred to as incubator projects or startup spaces or meanwhile projects. Here we've got a kind of co-work space, so a kind of bespoke wooden building that sits in amongst a cluster of containers. So it's really starting out with the idea of a stepping stone approach to local economy into local workspace. So you start with a desk, then you might transition to a kind of 100 square foot, 20-foot container, and then up to a 40-foot container, and maybe then you leave the campus where you're actually incubated and you have a sustainable business. So it's thinking about space differently. And we also worked effectively I worked as the kind of project leader, working with apprentices, using the whole construction process to help train and mentor young people who were at a local construction school. And then these are some of the Instagram posts from the site since completed. It's about 2/3 of workspace and 1/3 food and drink. It gets about 1 million visitors a year, which is quite incredible, really. And really, we use the footfall from the public visits to support I guess the affordable workspaces and the spaces for the communities and charities and all of the good work that they do behind the scenes with young local people. So the group called Makeshift that I helped to found, that became the organisation that run Pop Brixton, we then pitched as a team for a second project, this time run by Southwark Council in what were known locally as the empty levels of Peckham Car Park. So our project became Peckham Levels, And it was really to bring the similar ingredient that we developed and tested at Pop Brixton, but at a much larger scale. Pop Brixton is about 20,000 square feet, and this was about 80,000 square feet of workspace. And you can see on the left the kind of the dark, gloomy kind of car park spaces, and then on the right the way that we transform those spaces quite simply. And again, it had a kind of public floor with food, drink, events, yoga studios, bars, cafes, and then the image in the center there is the kind of car park levels below, which we have a kind of the roadways are maintained effectively with a whole string of studios. So there's around about 50 studios, and they're roughly the same size as a 20-foot shipping container. So again, a huge mix of different types of businesses, an incubator project, initially on a 7-year lease, but actually the council after having delivered the project are so delighted with the project that the lease has been extended to 15 years. So it's kind of testing that whole notion of what is temporary and what's permanent. And really we're thinking about these spaces as platforms for local people. What does somebody need? What's the minimum that they need in order to actually bring a business forward or a startup or a venture? Again, it's about 2/3 workspace. So we've got everything from print rooms to maker spaces, co-workspace, pottery workshops. Again, some of the Instagram posts from the members that rent space there. And I love this image. This is some of the 50 studios there, just showing some of those amazing local creative businesses. And the application process for space in these projects is also really important, and space is very much targeted at local people. And really, I think with obviously the conversation now around COVID and the way that people have rediscovered localism, really these projects were already looking at creating local provision and helping to stem the flow of people into the centre of cities. But this just shows what, with a very, very small space, the amazing kind of range of stuff that people can do within those spaces. So the third project, and the one I'm going to really focus on, is really the evolution of those first two projects. And this project was originally known as Clonico Quay because that's the name of the site, which is here. This is the copper box on the edge of the Olympic Park. This is the canal here, Hackney Wick, and this is here east. This site here is actually under construction at the moment as a housing scheme, and the site that we were awarded is actually the 7th site that will be delivering legacy housing on the Olympic Park, and that's probably somewhere like 10 to 12 years in the future. So this was the site as we found it. It's split level. This is the kind of rough grassland onto the canal. This is an access road to maintain a huge Thames water Victorian pipe that runs below this space. And then this was actually a coach park as part of the Olympic Park, and that's the power centre you can see in the distance there. So really we couldn't build on the lower part of the site because of the servicing, but it's also the upper part of the site's really disconnected from the canal. So it was really about how we could bring, again, the kind of same flavour of ingredients that we developed through Pop Brixton and Peckham levels and bring those to the Olympic sites. It was also about, in a way, safeguarding some of the uses that have developed organically in Hackney Wick opposite, which are being at least temporarily lost while the space is being redeveloped, and how we could support some of those uses on the edge of the Olympic site. So we looked at lots of different approaches. It was quite hard to get a handle on the scale of the site. We haven't really developed this way of thinking on an open site before. Quite a tricky site. There's not much around there in terms of, there's no real housing, there's no real permanent community there at the moment. It's kind of brownfield site really. So we looked at various strategies, and in the end, looking at scale, the third approach, this idea of developing a series of blocks, was the one that we plumped for. And some of the methods we used just to really test what we could actually fit on the site. And we very much are using kind of shipping container dimensions as a way of getting our head around the types of space that we might fit on the site. At the same time, we were doing lots of community consultation. really looking at what's happening around in Hackney Wick and what we could learn from that, and developing this idea of blocks here with kind of maker spaces and yards in between. So the idea of developing yards that during the day could be used for making or creative pursuits, and then at night become these kind of impromptu, almost like festival or event spaces, and that's kind of what goes on Hackney Wick. You can see here we're sort of maxing out the site, trying to cram as much on as we can to create a critical mass. What actually happened in reality was the site began to shrink as we discovered more and more about the constraints of the services running below that we couldn't build on. But yeah, here's some of the kind of early visuals that we were looking at from those block models. Also thinking about the sort of uses that may or may not be in the space. And this was really based on lots of those conversations we're having about local people, trying to again show that, you know, I think developing workspaces is thinking more about the possibility of what might happen rather than being really prescriptive. So here we've got a kind of a range of more bespoke buildings with the idea maybe of using containers in that central block. So yeah, this is just a drawing showing some of those feedback that we'd had from local people, talking about the kind of things, you know, everything down to the idea there isn't really a post office on the Olympic Park anywhere, those kind of day-to-day facilities that people need, like cash points and stuff like that. So at the kind of feasibility stage, when as a team makeshift or pitching for the project, this is kind of where we were at really as a design, with a kind of event space that was a bit like a Circus 10, maker spaces and artist studios at the back, and there's like a wharf side series of warehouses along the front, fronting onto the canal, that would have the kind of food and drink and bars and restaurants, that kind of thing. And some early visuals, also thinking about referencing gas cylinders, warehouse typologies, and yeah, you can see how the kind of project's progressing. And then the gas cylinder turns into a geodesic dome. And then we're starting to think about this series of streets and spaces. One of the lessons from Pop Brixton, I think, was about creating a real variety of spaces that you can explore, actually often creating quite narrow, constricted spaces, the sense of discovery. What we were really keen to do here was to actually create an open campus, so one that wasn't actually fenced off. So it becomes a real part of the city. It's kind of accessible 24/7. And then at the lower level, there's lots of discussions about relocating a skip garden and some very sort of light touch interventions, but definitely opening up the canal side with steps and walkways. Some of the lovely visuals that one of our guys, Tim, did early on in the project, just trying to get the sense of it's all about people, and the buildings are just there to actually create opportunities for people. And this is the idea of creating these kind of riverside moments where you can relink to the riverside and actually hang out and watch life go by. Some early facade studies looking at different finishes. And then at this point, the project became real. We started to head towards planning. And the model that you see here is fairly close to what we actually built in the end. You can see it's much more rationalized. The central block has kind of been lost because the site has shrunk. And effectively, we've got 5 buildings around a central yard, and 3 of the buildings at the front are connected so that you can walk between them without getting wet. And that's the idea of the kind of canal side, you know, these kind of quayside buildings, using a sawtooth roof as a kind of I guess a memory of what used to be there. It used to be a sweet factory called Clannicker Quay. And here you can see we're going through various VE processes and discussions, looking at how big or how small things should be. The workspace has shrunk to a single story at that point at the back. And then actually it gets kind of scaled back up to be 2 stories. The studio block was transparent at one point, and then that gets more solid. And then this is the kind of final set of images as we move towards the finished scheme. You can see we're anticipating the buildings being messed up, kind of kind of having artwork and sculptures, and really, again, the building's not being too precious, and that life takes over, the mess takes over, control chaos, skating, kind of fun. This is the view from the train. So construction started just towards the end of last year. Project was delivered as a design and build contract. We were novated over to the contractor at stage 5. It's a potentially contaminated site with a contamination layer just below the surface. So the buildings were designed on very super thin raft foundations to just float, and the rafts were polished, so that became the actual floor finish. And after many discussions about timber and steel and various other means of construction, steel frame was selected as the most efficient way to build the buildings quickly, also to allow them to be easily dismantled at the end of the project, and either to be rebuilt in whole or in part elsewhere, or to easily be recycled. So it was being really designed to be a giant Meccano kit. The whole thing was built really quickly, within about 9 months. That was over the COVID period as well. It would have been quicker without COVID. So I think we were looking at a sort of realistic build of 6 to 7 months here. But yeah, it was incredibly fast. Amazing to see, using really, I guess, kind of retail park construction technology in many ways. And again, we're sort of doing the absolute minimum that we need to do to create a sort of water and windproof series of buildings. Some of them are insulated, some of them are not. And we're trying to do the absolute minimum in order to keep the rents as low as possible and to make the project viable. So this will be a workspace on one of the upper levels, above some food and drink units. Here you can see the studio block in the foreground here. So this is kind of 3 stories of small studio workspaces, a bit like the ones that we've seen in Popham, Peckham levels. And these are the food and drink spaces along the front of the canal. They have a kind of internal insulated skin, and then they kind of have rails, and then an aluminium cladding over the surface that gives the building its kind of language. And then we're using brightly coloured windows and features to try and distinguish between the different blocks. Glencoe, the contractor, they did an amazing job. The translucent buildings kind of become now largely not translucent, but with just a translucent meeting room tower to act as a signal of the entrance. Here you can see that workspace building going up. I'll just flick through these. And then, yeah, the buildings are just simply lined. They're pretty much left raw for the tenants to actually fit out themselves. This is a co-work space. So they just have plywood walls, plywood floors, super simple, just everything as simple as it needs to be. So here you can see the finished images from a few weeks ago as the main contractor finished before Makeshift took over for some of the fit-out works. You can see the way that the building is really true to the model that we built quite early, and these kind of decks and staircases ready to link up to the life on the canal. This is the view from the school just across the way. And this is the kind of main entrance as you filter down from the Olympic Park heading north. The studio building in the foreground there acts as the sort of entry point. The units at ground floor level here act as kind of maker retail spaces. So somebody could be a jeweler, actually then using it as a little store to sell from as well. So it kind of doubles up the function. And the black building has kind of maker spaces at ground level with co-work above. We liken those units on the ground floor there to railway arches, so it's the same kind of stuff that you'd expect people to get up to in the railway arch as a sort of typology. This is before the landscaping went in, so it's just as the builder was leaving site, we took these shots just to show the kind of basic architecture, because the actual filling of the space was delayed because of lockdown and COVID. But we've got some shots just coming up. I'll just flick through these just to show how it has become to life, because very excitingly, it has just finally launched last week and opened. So I'm just going to flick through these images. So yeah, here you can see this is a double railway arch, or the double railway arch typology, so slightly bigger makerspace with a kind of shop window at one side and then the entry shutters at the back. The kind of lift and the route up to the co-workspaces, all the structures expressed. Again, it's that kind of light touch. We're just trying to do everything. Every element tries to double or triple up on use. This is one of those meeting room spaces. Amazing lights. This is this corridor with the small lettable studios either side, with a lovely view out to here east in the distance. That's a typical little studio on one of the upper floors. Co-workspace again. Slightly larger studio looking into the courtyard. This is the event space. So the event space is actually an acoustic box within a box. And this is the kind of where the bar will be. So you'll be able to enter into a sort of pre-bar and between performance kind of bar. And this is really trying to provide those smaller, probably 200 people event spaces that have been lost across London. And then this is the kind of market food hall, so sort of multi-purpose hall that can be used for street food and markets and events, that kind of thing. And some of the views that you begin to get back towards the canal and across the bridge. And we're just coming towards, so this was the opening night a few days ago. The workspaces are now pretty much let, I think. You can see the landscaping starting to go in, things are starting to come to life. This idea of agile uses and buildings as platforms, as people are almost camping out in their spaces to start with, just to get the thing open. So we've got a kind of net zero carbon bike delivery company moving in, nail bar, little coffee shop, printers, a whole sort of host of businesses starting to take the space over. Some guys just setting up a joinery workshop in one of the railway arch units. The courtyard with the graphics going in, that's me next to the guy in the orange mask there. So yeah, opening night was a fabulous night, just seeing the first few tenants moving in, the market space being used by a local youth market. So again, testing out, seeing how spaces work. And then we've got some really nice colour changing lights that really change the atmosphere, and you get a sense of, once we can have crowds back to places like this, how it's going to create really this amazing space where all sorts of things are going to go on the edge of Hackney Wick. And really, it's, you know, we've been able to deliver this project really learning the lessons of the great stuff that has been going on in Hackney Wick, and also what we've been doing in Pop Brixton and Peckham Levels. These are those kind of covered link spaces that you know, work great as kind of impromptu spaces. Amazing what difference lights can make, and some of those kind of spaces at the front here. So you can see it's going to become a really amazing community asset, I think, for this whole part of East London. This will be a platform for a lot of really amazing things that will go on in future. A little pop-up cafe for the opening night. So I think that's the last slide of my show. I'm going to hand you back to the audience now.
Thanks very much, Carl. Very interesting series of projects which encompass so many of the things that we've been talking about up to this point, in terms of you know, what still draws people to go out to work. Obviously, there's a type of space that isn't available at home, but also opportunities for meeting and other and a sort of a sense of it being a destination and not just a useful facility. I wonder if I could ask, you mentioned the subject of the minimum necessary that people can bring forward a business in, and some of the types that you mentioned are the sort of specific, typical places that people have started businesses: shipping containers, railway arches, and of course, if we look to Silicon Valley, the classic is the garage. And I wonder whether, I mean, you yourself have started at Pop Brixton with shipping containers, whether you've sort of formed a view on what is a sort of optimal unit size, you know, big enough but not too big for the sort of largest range of businesses, and what the sort of minimum amount of servicing provision or other kind of facilities make it viable for the largest number of people.
Yeah, we definitely start with the desk, and I suppose that's the co-workspaces are based on a desk module. And I think discovering the shipping container was a sort of happy coincidence, really. The idea of a 20-foot container, which is roughly about 120 square feet, is also coincidentally almost identical to a car parking bay, which we discovered at Port Brixton. So that 20-foot shipping container module is really the ideal DNA for small startup spaces, I think, which is, I guess the shipping container is just slightly narrower than you might ideally like. But yeah, it's perfect for 2 people or maybe one person. You can squeeze 4 into a 20-foot, but you'll probably start feeling a bit claustrophobic by then. So I think that basic module of about 6 by 2.4, 2.5 meters, you can then multiply that and have a double unit or triple unit. So those are the kind of base DNA units, and probably about 3 of those units, I would say, is a small railway arch. So if you're more of a maker who wants to do anything serious, then a railway arch is a great way of thinking about that kind of space. You know, it's rough and ready. It's got a kind of floor that you can bash up. And mostly with the units, we're just providing electricity to them, really basic lighting, probably some kind of broadband connection, and then the tenants really take it from there. We don't worry too much about heating, naturally ventilated wherever possible. So it's really about, you know, a sort of robust, no frill space, and I think that just has the widest possible appeal. And you know, we definitely found recently that co-work space seems to not be as popular. The idea of a lock-up unit seems to be, you know, flying off the shelf in many locations. But I think you do then see a demand for you know, clusters of people. You know, I'd say like minimum 10 units to create some kind of critical mass. Then you're going to want some kind of meeting space. There's maybe a shared kitchen, something like that. So there's a sort of basic DNA of a sort of cluster of workspaces.
Yeah, and the other thing obviously that's notable about those 3 projects together is that perhaps a while ago people were talking about workspace learning from hospitality and then having certain facilities within the workspace that makes people enjoy coming to work, bars or spas or whatever it might be. Those more seem to be workplaces embedded within sort of leisure or entertainment districts or developments. So you have you know, it's not so much bringing entertainment into work, is work into an area that sort of has a public entertainment purpose. Is that something that you think is going to be increasingly important now in terms of drawing people back to places of work?
Yeah, definitely. And we know that with retail as well, it's about destination retailing, putting on events. We talk a lot about curating space. So whether it's curating the whole site as an offer so that it's more attractive for people. So we found since lockdown was lifted that there's been an uptake in people coming forward wanting space, not necessarily to be there the whole time, but they've also realized that they don't want to work in their bedrooms the whole time either. So when they do go out, they want somewhere that feels a bit more lively, a bit more public, with a range of different things going on. So there may be a yoga studio and you know, bar, cafe, and all of those places become almost an extension of the workplace as well. You go and have a meeting in the coffee shop, go and grab lunch, but you're kind of at work still. So I think in order to make it different to the home, you do need those other ingredients. And I think it's, it feels like things need to be less containerized. They're actually mixed together as a range of ingredients. Some ingredients might change over time, but you know, I think the days of just being able to have kind of a big sort of generic office block are going to be severely challenged in the future, I think.
Yeah. Well, at that point, can we bring our other speakers back in? We have some questions that are coming through on each of those presentations, and so perhaps I might ask each one in turn those. And the first to Matt follows on a bit from what Carl's just been talking about, and that's that in your presentation you talked as much about the operation of space as the design of space. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts about whether the sort of considering the two in parallel or in as a combined thing might be a new workplace specialism, or whether you might still expect to see a division in terms of who handles either of those things, the operation and programming of space and the physical design of space.
Yeah, I think certainly that is absolutely one of the things that we feel
distinguishes us, that we both work with developers. So in this case, you and I group, but also they recognized as a regeneration-oriented property developer who've also done fantastic meanwhile use, similar to what Carl's been showing us, that unless you really get a grip on the operations and try and offer something new, then you can only go so far, or it works in a particular way. So I really love the contrasts maybe of the presentations here, where Carl's absolutely showing the minimum, and we're saying actually we're choosing not to go with the minimum. We're choosing a much more high level of service. I think also for me, picking up on some of the echoes of your questions to Francis, was around sort of business models and structures that either inhibit or encourage people to do that. And I would say that certainly we have found that many people from the construction and architecture background just think in terms of the container, and then other people, perhaps from the hospitality industry, think about service. But actually, those people from the hospitality service don't think about making. And they certainly see bandsaws and all the rest of it, and specialist extraction systems, as a nightmare of health and safety. So again, I'm sort of very conscious that we are choosing to integrate an awful lot because we believe it is necessary actually to push these businesses forward. If we're really talking about supporting early stage businesses, or indeed helping much bigger established businesses to regenerate and to be agile and to respond to the requirement of innovation, in brackets, especially COVID, then actually we want to propose that sort of support for organizational change, for innovation and all the rest of it, for collaboration and partnership, is as much a bit of the workspace. So yes, we believe fundamentally in the integration, but we think it is quite hard, and we think that's part of, I suppose in commercial terms, our competitive advantage, that most people will not be bothered, will not realize it's important, and will struggle perhaps to bring all of those things together.
And Francis, Matt just alluded there to the discussion earlier about restrictions, and that a couple of people have asked further questions about that. One has asked how you would said absolutely agree with what you propose in terms of live work, but how would you advise architects on how to sneak in live workspace into developments? And someone else has asked a related question, which is to do with whether you think it would be a good idea to have residential developments which had, as it were, co-working areas, say one floor of a tower set aside for shared workspace, rather than workspaces within each unit.
I think we have to stop thinking about housing. I mean, I just think that housing as a concept in many ways is now outdated, as is workspace in many ways. I think that the two things in some ways have to be thought of together, and we need to start to design our cities and our buildings with this in mind. And so in terms of how to sneak it in, architects need to understand what are the crucial aspects that are important, the crucial principles that are important for designing for home-based work, one of which is degrees of spatial separation between the two things. The having them close by each other really doesn't work for lots of people. And yes, the principle of having shared workspaces in larger housing developments is a solution, but I think that it's still problematic if people are thinking about housing. It's like that's why I call them work homes. I think we have to actually really take this sort of binary system that we've got and reconfigure it. And so the workshop solutions that Matt's talking about and Carl's talking about a bit, many people I've seen who use machinery actually want to work from home, and there's no reason why a joiner shouldn't work from home. There's absolutely none. And so but it's a different sort of building that you're talking about. Obviously, they're really different constraints. So I'm not sure if I've answered that question. But,
yeah, I think so. And well, I mean, again, on a regulatory theme, one of the questions, as Carl asks, how you dealt with building regs and so on in terms of uninsulated space, and likewise, someone else has asked about the difficulty of using prefabricated units such as shipping containers, which obviously relates to some of your earlier work, but shipping containers in where you have to deal with things like level thresholds and so on.
Yeah, with shipping containers, effectively we've had to build decks around them, remove the doors so that we can create a level threshold at ground floor level to remove those thresholds. So that's just a kind of a spatial thing. Sorry, I can't remember what the other question was. It
was an uninsulated space.
Yeah, that's right. So we had to look at a whole life cycle carbon approach, looking at a 12-year lifespan, looking at the carbon that would be used to insulate buildings, and whether we could actually save that energy usage over 12 years. And then also looking at comfort levels. So there was an offsetting approach taken, a sort of common sense approach taken to what the buildings would be used for. And so, for instance, the event space, although it wasn't a requirement to insulate it for heating comfort, in the end, because of planning constraints, we had to acoustically separate it, building a box within a box. So that was then quite an expensive, laborious thing to do, but that was so that we could operate a music venue effectively. So yeah, I think what it does, meanwhile thinking, forces everybody to reconsider what's important about a project, because there is a kind of limited lifespan, and to look at where you spend the money and what the reason for targeting money in a particular area is. Because we're working in the Olympic Park, they were quite strict about code compliance and accessibility, so we had to put lifts in all of the buildings, whereas in previous meanwhile projects we just had a percentage of areas that were fully accessible, again recognizing that they're kind of short-term projects. So each project is different, but we definitely try and take a common sense approach to building regs and planning, etc.
And another question relates in different ways to all of your presentations, I think, which is it's coming from an architect in the Lakes, and was just sort of saying that, you know, very interesting, brilliant presentations. But what about thoughts about relevance to out of city and town micro businesses? And so I suppose that the question to each in turn would be, you know, to Matt, it's somehow adaptable is your model to the countryside in terms of, you know, local population density and so on, whether that would make a difference. To Francis, it was whether home working is as it were has more scope and more opportunity given more space in the countryside. And to Carl, it was a you know, a kind of question about affordability, about once you get outside the high land value, high property, high rent areas of inner urban situations. Does your model become? I think there's an interest in cost per square meter, basically, and how where that would work. So so I don't know if you want to take it in that order.
Yeah, shall I respond then? Yeah, absolutely. I think quite clearly at the moment we are saying that our particular solution that we've attempted to construct so that it is a scalable solution and can be accelerated across the UK is very much one for cities and towns. And so here I am in Brighton, and you know, I think there's a lot of interest from smaller towns to the west and east, and therefore that will be a question for us. What is the minimum critical mass perhaps of people that we feel we can support? Because essentially we are really, if you want to talk about sneaking in, we are actually a classic office building, B1, and we're sneaking in some of the kind of maker spaces and other sort of bells and whistles, and all of the sort of health and safety associated with that. So I think that we see ourselves as in towns and cities, in high streets and perhaps university campuses at this point.
And Francis, I don't know if you...
Absolutely. The countryside is teeming with home-based work. There are so many. There's a higher proportion of home-based workers in the countryside than in the city or the suburbs. And yes, absolutely, more space makes it easier for people to have decent-sized workspaces and with the sort of relationship that they want between their home and the work aspect of their lives. But of course, the issues of social isolation and invisibility operate here as well. And I think that what one finds when you drive through the countryside is all sorts of houses have little signs outside saying manicurist and masseur or joiner or whatever it is. And so lots of people do advertise their home-based work in the countryside in a way that they don't in the city, probably because they're mostly people in the city are working covertly. And I think that the whole issue of social isolation can be a problem. And so I think that some of the urban hub type ideas are beneficial, although one of the advantages of home-based work is you don't have to pay you don't have to pay rent. And so I'm a great proponent of a resurgence of the library as a space where home-based workers can actually work together and meet. So it's something that is provided by the local authority that is accessible to all.
Perhaps a use for all these deserted parish churches around the place. We can make them into co-working spaces in villages. Carl, do you want to pick up on the cost and affordability question?
Yeah, so we're working lots more, actually more out of London at the moment. So we launched Ashford Coachworks late last year. I've actually set a separate organisation up to run that, and in all honesty, we found it much more challenging. The rent levels that we've achieved there are a lot lower than London. We've had to drop the rent levels until we got to a point where people started to jump on board. So I guess each place you're kind of testing. We're also working in Weston-super-Mare and lots of other places. And typically the build costs are going to be roughly the same wherever you are. Might be slightly higher in the southeast, but not significantly. So we're something like Peckham Levels. I think that was achieved on around about £350 a square metre. So it's incredibly low costs repurposing of that building. Pop Brixton probably more like £1,400 a square metre, largely because of the services and landscaping lifted up those costs a bit. I think Clarnico Quays around about 1,600 a square metre. So you can see there's a sort of escalating scale there depending on the typology. But I think there is a huge demand for these types of space across the UK, I think. And I think from a small village, you can see there's definitely a need to revitalise villages, and work could be a really great way to do that. The idea that isolated home workers can have that kind of central new type of community workspace within villages. And then towns like Weston, we've been working there with the council. A lot of people did commute from Weston into Bristol every day, and now we found there's a huge number of people that don't want to do that, or they're not having to do that anymore because of technology. So now the idea of that allows impetus to the project to actually develop these more local workspaces, somewhere like Weston, which will then help with the kind of seasonal issues that somewhere like Weston has. So I think the power of decentralizing work, but not necessarily to every single house, but into sort of more local centres, it's a really powerful story that's happening. And I guess the design industry needs to wake up and lead designing the kind of spaces that are going to help people live the way they want to live.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, we sort of end there, because I'm afraid we do have to come to an end, about where we started, saying that whatever happens to work, and it's being sped up by what's happened in the last several months, is going to affect everything else, from where people are able to live to how much public transport they choose to use, to where they get their entertainment, and the life of cities, but also the life of places outside cities, and the cities that perhaps have not been so lively, or the towns, the settlements that have not been so lively until now. So unsurprisingly, we've not exhausted the topic in the hour and a half that we've had, and we will have to return to it another time. Sadly, we also haven't been able to get to everybody's questions, but thank you very much for posting them. One of the questions was whether this will be made available to people later, and the answer is yes. It will be within a couple of days on the Architecture Today website, and it's also on the Architecture Today YouTube channel, or it will be. And if you're going there, please do check out some of our earlier similar events on different subjects, because there's quite an archive there now. So it only remains for me to say thank you very much to our event partner Schueco. A particular thanks to our three speakers for really excellent and stimulating presentations. Thank you. And thank you finally to the audience. Thank you for tuning in and asking questions and for your attention, and I hope to see you for the next one. In the meantime, goodbye.